richest people, and Time's Person of the Year. If you can do it, we can decide who's the best at it. We love to measure ourselves one against the other to find ways to quantify who's the greatest. It would seem humans tend to find a great deal of validation in being great. Today, it's almost as if the challenge of keeping up with the Joneses is something we're born into. We're expected, trained to unassumingly want faster cars and bigger homes in the best neighborhoods, more prestigious titles with the newest gadgets. But to put it bluntly, what today's gospel is once again saying in no uncertain terms is that the way the world understands greatness and what Jesus means is very different. William Barclay, who's a noted biblical commentator of a previous generation, put the point sharply. He said, "The world may assess a person's greatness by the number of people whom they control and who are at their beck and call, or by their intellectual standing and their academic eminence, or by the number of committees of which they are a member, or by the size of their bank balance and the material possessions which they've amassed. But in the assessment of Jesus Christ, these things are irrelevant. His assessment is quite simply, how many people have you helped? His assessment is quite simply, how many people have you helped?" But even so, notice, in this passage, Jesus does not actually say there's anything wrong with being great according to the world's measure. There's nothing wrong with going to a good college or having material possessions or being a respected member of the community. It's just that for Christians, these aren't measures of greatness. For those who follow Christ, greatness is measured in a particular way. It's about our service to others. Jesus says to the disciples, "Whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant. And whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all." Did you notice the turn there? He doesn't even just say that to be great is to be servant. He says to be greatest is to be slave. To be a slave. And yet, I think one of the dangers we find in this passage is that we can turn Jesus' call to serve into an excuse for not having big dreams or ambitions, to make ourselves small, to just be a servant. But the problem is not that there are people in the world who are gifted musicians or talented business people or brilliant academics. Those are wonderful things. Being called to a life of servanthood is not the same as being called to lead small lives. Frederick Buechner has famously said that vocation is a place where your deep gladness meets the world's deep need. And to meet the deep needs of the world, we need to be more than just living small lives. The point's not that we're supposed to avoid greatness as the world defines it and instead strive for some kind of mediocrity. But instead, what we are called to do is use the passions and skills God has gifted us with in service of the other, in service of the stranger and the outcast among us. Jesus doesn't want us to let our gifts languish, and the gospel calls each of us to live fully and abundantly. And James and John, they seem to think that this full life comes from merely sitting near Jesus, that somehow that alone gives them this greatness that they desire. As one commentator on this passage notes about this, most American students are convinced by their grade school teachers that there's no such thing as a stupid question. Well, James and John put the lie to that fairy tale. They ask a really bad question. Having just been told by Jesus that his messianic identity is about suffering, death, and resurrection, they ask if they can sit on his right and left side in his glory. Wow, talk about not getting it, right? And of course, today's gospel comes immediately after the third time Jesus talks about his ministry leads to suffering and death. There's a cost to this kind of life. And this is the third time the disciples seem to miss the point. And in fact, the disciples not getting it seems to be a marked theme. And in fact, the only space they actually get it isn't in the gospel as much as it's after Jesus actually dies and rises and the community's left to be his witnesses in the world. And I can't help but think the repetition is Mark saying to his readers, pay attention. This is so important that Jesus had to teach about it repeatedly, and so I'm going to repeat it for you too. Being great and being a servant are bound irrevocably together. And so perhaps recognizing this lesson is hard enough that Jesus repeats it for us. It should encourage us to wonder, how might we too be like those disciples who just don't quite get it sometimes? What is it we're missing? How is it we are unintentionally confusing the world's understanding of greatness with the one that Jesus is lifting up for us? As I look at my own life and I consider tomorrow and the next day, what does it really mean to say that being great is a matter of being a servant? What kind of impact does acknowledging that truth make to us and the choices we make? As I wonder about all this, if I'm being honest, there's this other thing happening too, this voice in me rising up that sometimes wonders, if being a servant is what greatness entails, do I even really want to be great like that? Or do I just want people to think I'm great? Do I just want people to treat me like I'm great without actually having to do all that serving stuff? And so as always, I think the challenge becomes not just about hearing Jesus' words, not even just about understanding Jesus' word about this relationship between service and greatness. It's about making the choice to live this truth. It's about making the choice to be a reflection of the love Jesus has made known in his life, death, and resurrection. And of course, ultimately, the good news is that the strength to choose this life is not something we have to find on our own. It comes from God. It's a gift from God. But it's also only a gift we receive when we ask for it. Benjamin Zander's a classical conductor. He was presenting at a conference on leadership. It was actually a TED Talk. It was to a room of about 1,600 people. And as he completed a piece of music by Chopin he was using for an illustration, the audience began to vigorously applaud. And in that moment, he did something I found truly remarkable. And it had nothing to do with the music itself. He stood up from his piano, he turned to the audience, and he clapped for them. Enthusiastically, not elegantly, not sort of, but clapped for them, walking back and forth across the stage, vigorously clapping for them. Because he recognized in that moment that the thing that had happened between them required him to play, yes, but them to listen too. And that there was greatness between the space of those things. He dramatically shifted the dynamics of that interaction by refusing for the appreciation to be one-sided. He refused to be placed above the audience, but rather recognized how in that moment his greatness was merely a reflection of the gifts that he'd been given to share. And perhaps servant greatness is about recognizing that wherever we stand, even if it's in a position of authority, in front of an orchestra or a congregation or a president of a PTA or a member of a board of executives, it's not first and foremost about us. Despite what James and John think merely to be given a seat of power, even to be given a seat next to Jesus, is not to have achieved greatness. Jesus teaches us that greatness is not about where you sit. Just a few moments ago, I quoted William Barclay as saying that Jesus' understanding of greatness amounts to how many people have you helped. But I want to nuance this point a bit more because I think there's a trap in it too. Because this way of articulating what it means to be great can actually become its own kind of numbers game, right? Like you create your graph and whoever's at the top has helped the most people somehow, well, they're the greatest. They've achieved that. And you turn it into this other misunderstanding of what Jesus is talking about. Helping a lot of people is a wonderful thing, but so is living a life where you dedicate it to helping 2 or 3 people, and that's what your life's given to, right? It's not about the number of people we help. It's about leading a life characterized by this kind of service Jesus calls us to. It's about parents who lovingly care for children and about children who devotedly come to care for their aging parents. It's about the food collected at churches and food banks for those who are hungry, about homes built by people with Habitat for Humanity or young people on missions trips. It's about hours spent tutoring teenagers for the GED. It's about executives who say no to unethical practices despite the professional costs. It's about lovingly cooked dinners shared with friends and family. It's about money raised to support refugees. It's about meals delivered to families in crisis. It's about prayer shawls lovingly knit to be a sign of God's love. It's about the choice to be a friend to someone in need, even when it's inconvenient. This is what the greatness Jesus is talking about looks like. I'm willing to bet each of us have had moments in which the cultural narrative of greatness, which we're constantly bombarded with, has been upended by experience in which the greatness Jesus speaks of bursts through. And we see that something deeper God is always inviting us into. Moments in which we've seen beyond ourselves to that something more. Moments in which we've been given so freely of ourselves only to receive so much more in return. And that's God's economy. To give and yet receive even more. So let us once more reject the shallow definitions of greatness our culture projects on us. And by the grace of God, embrace this life of servanthood that Jesus invites us into. This abundant life. Because it's precisely who we've been made to be. In the name of the one who came for us, to save us, to show us what it means to live as God's beloved people. And then also to share that love with others. Amen.